Well, lucky us, we get to talk to Tara Ryder about history and New York Harbor, and she's an expert in this topic and proudly hails from University of New York, Stony Brook, a great part of the world to be out there, to say the least. But Tara, I have to start off with a story. So when I was a junior at New York Maritime, State University, New York Maritime College, circa 1971, we got a football team going. Now I was on a sailing team, so I went to watch the football game. And our first game ever from that college was against Stony Brook. And the New York Daily News did their football predictions in the Friday paper, Notre Dame, Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. And they said Stony Brook 40, New York Maritime 0 was their prediction. And then they had a little inscription underneath that said, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, what should we do? It's 4th down and 20, and we're back on the 2." Well, the coach posted that on the locker room wall, and that got everybody inspired. And I think Maritime won 10-7. So anyway, sorry about that.
Sometimes we've got to take our losses, but Seawolves will always come back.
But you're at a great school and a lot going on, and a lot of work in the environment that goes on out there too. So New York Harbor is a fascinating place. I mean, in the early days when the country was being formed in the early 1800s and through the early 1900s, the waterfront was not a tidy place. It was dirty, and there was a lot going on, and people didn't want to be there. It smelled badly, but eventually people started to realize, hey, this waterfront is valuable, and we want to see the water. And when do you think the transition started to happen, where the waterfront was a place not to be, to become a place that people really sought it out?
It's a good question. I mean, traditionally, it's the poor who lived closest to the water because that was where you were more likely to have dirty water that led to wonderful, fabulous diseases like dysentery and cholera. So the poor lived in those areas, and you see that in the 19th century. If you look at like the different immigrant groups like 5 Points when the Irish came in the middle to the end of the 19th century. But you start to, during this period of the 19th century, start to get a growing awareness of environmental issues. And the two big ones are air and water, cleanliness. And so as you get into the beginning of the 20th century and you get like the progressive movement, there is a growing idea of we need clean water. And this is where you'll see in like New York City, the roots of the sanitation department, the idea of how can we bring clean water, for drinking to everyone. Because if someone gets sick, it's going to spread throughout the city. But you don't really start to get the push in New York Harbor, I would say, until closer to the middle of the 20th century. And again, much of it is tied, like the understanding of we need to do this, but really, how do we do it? How do I want to say, the funding to do things like this really is kind of coming out of that environmental movement of the 1960s, 1970s. And we'll start to see as you get to the end of the 20th century, that growing awareness. You get projects like the Billion Oyster Project, which is to help clean up, the water there. And that's coming out of that kind of turn of the 21st century. So the awareness was there, the idea of how do we do this? Because again, simply the sheer scope of use of these waterways and all of the different ways that our waterways were getting polluted, whether it was through sewage, through shipping, made it a really complicated question.
Well, the Oyster Project is extraordinary, what that has done. It sounds simple. Oh, let's put oysters and we'll grow them. And yet they clean up the water dramatically.
They can clean up to 50 gallons. Each oyster can clean up to 50 gallons a week.
Wow.
So putting in 1 billion oysters, and it is a phenomenal project. I am very proud. I've had so many students and colleagues who've been involved in this project. And it really is making a significant difference in cleaning up those waterways and thinking about what does that then bring in, the type of diversity that you're going to get in these areas. Again, just improves from an environmental viewpoint, but also ultimately there's an economic benefit that comes out. So, recognizing all of the variables that go into this makes it such an incredible project.
One of my favorite things to do, especially with grandkids, is do the Circle Line trip around Manhattan. On the one hand, maybe it's a little bit hokey, but every time it's cool and you learn something new and it's great fun. And one of the things that you see as a sailor going around Manhattan is the currents are pretty swift, certainly on the East River side, but the Hudson too is really something. So I got to think those swift moving currents certainly must help clean the waters and help that. Is that correct?
It definitely plays into it, but it's also shifting a lot of the pollution. So, pollution that's in one area does get shifted to new areas, and it is something to be aware of. But it is, it's one of the challenges from an environmental viewpoint, from a sailing viewpoint. I mean, the fact that it was called Hell's Gates goes all the way back to Adrian Block in the 1500s, who was like, I don't want to go back that way. Let me go discover what else is out there. And he figures out there's a long island. So again, it is a challenging area, but it does have a lot of potential of, what can be done with those currents and how it can, improve our waterways. Can we shift out pollutants?
I think there was a book that I picked up at a Barnes and Noble about 10 or 12 years ago called Mannahatta. It was about what Manhattan was like in the early days. So before the Dutch got here and the early settlers, there were certainly some indigenous peoples. We know that story. But describe what Manhattan was like and on the Jersey side and the Queens side. What was this area? What did it look like back then?
I mean, first of all, we have to recognize that Manhattan was smaller than what it is today. About a
Oh,
third of Manhattan is reclaimed land that grew over time, because one of the challenges to Manhattan is you can only expand outwards so much. So as we start to see settlement in late 1700s into the 1800s, they do build up the southern portion of Manhattan. This is why there's actually old schooners have been found when they did some of the archaeological work after 9/11, and they found an old schooner down there, and that's where they basically sunk it to give something for the dirt to hold on to. So we do have to think about the fact that it's a smaller land, but it also had a lot more animal diversity. If we look at, the Long Island, the Jersey, Manhattan areas, we had things like wolves, we had bears, we had bobcats. So it was a very mixed environment when we think about it, of trees. The native populations, the Algonquins, the Lenape, Indians were all horticulturalists as well as hunters. So again, they were also not first and foremost, but definitely also using the waterways. So shellfishing was definitely part of their way of life. No matter how we look at it, this area has always historically, with the peoples living here, whether they were indigenous populations or the Europeans coming over, were living in a coastal zone. And they were making use of our waterways, from fishing to shell fisheries to whaling was going on in these areas, as well as using the land itself to grow crops like corn and, beans and what we think of as the Three Sisters.
can you imagine somebody from the 1500s coming in a time machine and seeing Manhattan today?
It would be definitely a very different world from what they had seen in the 1500s. I mean, we have to recognize the lack of trees that we have today compared to, this would have been a much more wooded area at that time. Again, we use the wood, as Europeans came over, they, used the wood. Adrian Block, who I mentioned before, and who is seen as the kind of namer of Long Island, built what was probably the first European boat in this part of the world. So, immediately those trees were seen as a boon to shipbuilding. Something that especially the English are going to focus quite heavily on, because they needed tall trees to make the masts for these tall ships. So the types of ships that we're seeing coming in.
Well, talking about schooners and boats being built, back in 1851, a guy named John Cox Stevens, now Stevens Institute of Technology over in Hoboken. And some of his friends built a boat, a schooner, at an invitation for a big fair that was taking place in London. And they didn't call the boat Hoboken or Manhattan, they called it America, and sailed it across the ocean and beat the British. I think there were 18 boats racing around the Isle of Wight, and America clobbered them. And that started a regatta that's still going on today called the America's Cup. And but I think that moment kind of sent a message to the world that American naval architecture and navigational prowess and sailing skill was something to reckon with.
I mean, we definitely have to recognize by the middle of the 19th century, this is a period when whaling is definitely being done all over the world, the Atlantic, the Pacific, up into our northern Arctic waters. And the American whalers were at the forefront of this type of exploration. So those types of sailing vessels were definitely part of our history, our naval story. We also see, this is the rise in the period of the clipper ships, which would become, the fastest ships of that time period, bringing valuable cargo like pepper, as quickly as possible, as well as, passengers and things like mail. The idea was they clipped along at a good speed. And so we definitely see this period of the 19th century, the growing rise of American maritime power. We'd had a dip, if we think about it, in the kind of a beginning of the 19th century, as we had our growing pains, we could argue, as a new country. But by the middle of the 19th century, we are expanding economically, and that's going to help us politically, but ultimately it's naval power and maritime power is part of that story.
It's extraordinary. I mean, so much of this, we today take all this for granted, but these people were groundbreaking and innovators, and there wasn't a manual on how to do this. And they were building vessels, as you point out, all around New York, the Yacht America being one. Of course, that was based on a pilot boat, the pilots going out. And you wanted to have a fast pilot boat because you wanted to be the first to get to the ship. So you got the commission before anybody else. So they were actually racing back at that time. I mean, it'd be good to go back in a time machine and look at it. And I think we'd all probably be horrified at what we saw and be grateful where we are today. The Hudson River is fascinating to me too. You imagine you've come across the ocean, you're kind of coming up this harbor, no bridges or anything. And the river, the Hudson River, just keeps going and going and going. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. And of course, that helped commerce and certainly helped New York and New Jersey as well with shipping and commerce.
It definitely opens up. I mean, we have to recognize that with the opening of the Erie Canal by 1825, that linked New York City right across the northern part of the United States. It pretty much put the city as the economic hub of the United States, because we had that connection with Europe and with the rest of the Atlantic world, but now we could also connect through the Great Lakes with all of that growing expansion in the 19th century of moving westward. And the Hudson River is definitely, part of that story of how do we grow not only as a city, as a state, but ultimately as a country as well.
Well, one of the most iconic figures in New York with the pilots and air pilots and sailors always talk about the lady. And of course, I'm talking about the Statue of Liberty, which is such a thing. And it's fascinating. The French sent that over in ships. I think it was something like 200 crates with it all. And it got here. We didn't have the money to build it. So they had to wait to get enough money to build the base before they could put this thing on top. But that Statue of Liberty is such an iconic thing. And anytime you're out in the harbor and see that, and it must have meant a lot to people that ended up in Ellis Island and coming in and seeing the Statue of Liberty.
It's something to keep in mind. It welcomed all of these immigrants who were arriving, in the latter part of the 19th century, right into today. But it was also one of the things we have to remember, the last thing that so many sailors saw when they were leaving on these transatlantic and, transglobal journeys. But it was also then the first, one of the, first things where you say, I'm home. You would see Montauk Lighthouse was one of those symbols, but Our Lady was definitely another one as they would come in. And it meant you had safely arrived back. You had successfully arrived back. And again, recognizing that, sailing historically was a dangerous job, that you have to imagine the sheer joy of seeing that.
I have a story, if you would like to hear it. It involves the
Definitely.
Statue of Liberty. It's an international story, and it taught a little bit of local knowledge. So I went to college in New York City, up in the Bronx. My wife's from Brooklyn, and I grew up over in a place called New Jersey. And in 1986, there was a regatta called the Liberty Cup. And this was during the era where we were celebrating the Roeblings with Brooklyn Bridge. And it was a tennis ladder elimination with 8 countries, and I was representing the U.S. And you have USA on your sail, you want to perform well. Well, we eliminated down, and we were up against some country called Australia. And the crew on the Australian boat were the very crew, the same guys that had taken the America's Cup away from the New York Yacht Club a few years earlier. Now I'm racing them in the final of this regatta. And the course, we started right off the ferry dock at Liberty Island and went south toward the Verrazano Bridge. And then we would work our way with the spinnakers up, going with the wind to a buoy kind of off the battery. So it was up, down, and back up to the finish line. And we were behind them going downwind. And the current was ebbing out of New York. It was strong, maybe 3 knots, 3 nautical miles an hour. So it's going slow, and we're about 4 boat lengths behind. And I'm scratching my head. How are we going to pass these guys? This is hard. And I thought, I wonder if the current's less behind Liberty Island and Ellis Island. So I sent my crew below to look at the chart, and they said, oh, it's 5 feet deep back there at low tide. Well, it's middle tide now, and we only draw 5 feet. Let's go. So we sailed away from the Australians, went behind Liberty Island, went behind Ellis Island. There was no current. In fact, there was a counter current going the other way. And by the time we got to the mark off the battery, we were way ahead of the Australians and won the race. They were really upset. Fast forward 1 year. A year later, we're in the final again. Australians are in the final again. There we are, battling the ebb current going out of the Hudson River, New York Harbor. The Australians are behind us this time, but only about 2 boat lengths. And they jibed away from us to pull the same trick on us that we'd pull up on them a year earlier. But the sad part about the story is we didn't have our onboard cameras and microphones aboard their boat to see the look on their faces and what they had to say when they got behind Liberty Island, to find out that that winter, a bridge had been built from Ellis Island over to New Jersey. By the time they came back around, we won that race too. So anyway, that's my fun story.
I like that story. Oh, always important to check those charts to see what might have changed.
Well, local knowledge made it. When they jived away, I thought, oh my God, they don't know there's a bridge, which is about 8 feet high, that bridge from Ellis Island over to New Jersey. It was a good thing to put. But anyway, we won that race too. So that was my fun story, which was right up there with the Knicks winning this year, which was just great fun for everybody. I watched every moment of every game. So
I was about to say a lot of New York pride. I will admit I watched part of the game, and I'm not even a native New Yorker, so.
Well, they weren't expected to do well, and they came from behind, and everybody likes an underdog, and you could tell they were playing their heart out. Who's not going to respect that? So anyway, it was very cool.
Yeah, it was definitely exciting for everyone.
I have a question for you. I'm going to shift gears here. This is a really hard one. So I was around, and I'm guessing you were too, back in 1976. The last time we celebrated the 200th anniversary. I don't know, it's scarier that we're celebrating the 250th. It's been 50 years gone by since the 200th. But here's my question. What's New York Harbor and New York going to look like 50 years from now, or even 100 years from now?
I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I definitely don't have any magic 8-ball for to be able to guess why, what it will look like. I am hoping that it will be cleaner. That path that we've seen with projects like the Billion Oyster Project will continue. I'd like to see it still having that same kind of usage, still, where we celebrate what it stands for with, people arriving and seeing the Statue of Liberty. I do think that we will continue to be an economic hub, so we're still going to have to think about, the larger, ships coming in, thinking about that element of cargo. I mean, how many of us, shop online and somewhere those products have to make it to the US? But it is something exciting. I do think it is going to continue to be a hub, just as we saw it as a hub in the 1600s and the 1700s, and we saw it grow in usage by the time you get to the 1800s into the modern 20th century. I think it's simply going to continue to grow. The question of, what vessels will be coming in, our vessels have gotten larger over the years. That may shape some of the design and how it's used, but I do think that it will continue to be a center point and an attraction. So both use, but also that moment of pride, of looking and going, this is the heart of, coming into New York, and thinking about what it represents as opportunity, as hope, and ultimately, how it's connected deeply to our history as New Yorkers, as Americans, as well as its global role.
So when I think of the tall ships and other vessels coming in New York Harbor on July 4th, there'll be a festive day, probably a little bit warm out, but a festive day. I think of spectators in two ways. Certainly people on Governor's Island and on both shorelines and up in buildings. There'll be a lot of people watching. At the same time, there's going to be a lot of people, cadets, midshipmen, officers on these tall ships, the Class A's and the smaller vessels coming in New York, and they're looking at everybody else. And I'm guessing that many of them probably never been to New York before. And on vessels, as you know, when you're out at sea, you're by yourself. It's rare you see another vessel. And now all this attention. So it's going to have an impact on these people. And I hope they have good feelings about being in New York from being here. And the camaraderie between the crews of the boats as they get to know each other is pretty special as we bring everybody together.
Yeah, I do agree because, there are going to be, you know, thousands and thousands of tourists coming to see these vessels, but these vessels themselves, we could argue, are tourists as well. They're coming from all over the world. We have them coming from, Italy and Germany and Europe, but we have them coming from India and Chile. As you said, both the Type A and the smaller vessels. And for many of them, this will be their first experience for the cruise, especially coming. And thinking about the kind of exchange of just of ideas and thoughts and experiences, and just the simple excitement of all of this is really something I'm quite excited about.
So I've sailed on several of these ships and the smaller vessels, the Lynx, Pride of Baltimore, vessels like that. And I've done a transatlantic on a Dutch boat called the Stad Amsterdam, obviously named after the city of Amsterdam, like we were at one point, the Dutch. And one of the things that astounded me doing these boats is they're faster than you think. We were averaging about 15 nautical miles an hour. So to push a 400-foot vessel at 15 knots is pretty good under wind alone. But how much work it is hauling all those lines, and they're complicated. So you have to learn all the different sails. They all have a name: the royals, the gallants, the skysails, the mainsails, staysail. I mean, everything's got a name, and everybody knows which rope to pull, and there's hundreds of ropes all over the place, and you got to learn that. And what it surprised me was how much good teamwork and leadership there are on these vessels to make it all work and have it sail efficiently and do it safely. You are in the ocean. Going across the ocean, the only thing better than 30 miles an hour is 40 miles an hour on one of these tall ships, because they can take it and they just go a little bit faster, which I'm sure was important to the owners in commerce to have boats like that.
It is something to keep in mind. I have to give a shout out to the Harvey Gamage, which is one of the smaller vessels, having worked on her.
It's a good
Um,
one. I've been on it.
it is. And one of the things I definitely saw was the camaraderie that was on board with, the crew, and they are an ocean classroom setting. So the students who come on board for those lengths of time, and over the years, I've seen people's friendships that started on board the Gamage that have continued, decades after sailing on board. And you are working side by side, but it's not just working. You're living side by side. You're entertaining each other in a very small world. And in many ways, that really highlights the experiences that sailors had historically. They were at sea in this world that basically is limited by, the bowsprit of the boat and the stern of the boat. And these are the people you're going to bond with, because again, you are battling Mother Nature, whether it's simply over survival, or how, can you get that extra knot or two, if you put a little bit more sail out, of thinking about that. And you really create um, bonds with people that you may not have expected to. And that's something we do see coming out of kind of maritime history, is the different support systems that rolled out of the forecastle, as they said, of friendships that occurred on these ships. And you had crews that typically would come from all over the world, so you had kind of knowledge that was being exchanged. But it is a world that you come in as a green hand knowing nothing, and having to very quickly learn because you want to survive.
There was a retired ship captain that I knew when I was young. When I say young, I was probably in my early 20s. He was 70, and at the time I thought he was kind of old. Today, I don't think he's so old at all. But he would say to the crews on his vessels, all sailing vessels, if everybody does just a little bit more than they're expected of their job, we're going to be in great shape. And that's resonated with me all these years later. Everybody does their job and a little more, and the whole thing runs like clockwork. That's where you get that sense of teamwork. And as you point out, people will see each other 30 years later, and oh, we were on that ship together, and you're bonded from that experience of the ocean crossing that you might have done. I think some of these cadets or midshipmen might not understand that now, but they will as time goes by.
And they're getting an experience when you're on these boats of being so close to nature in a way that you may not get on, a Coast Guard cutter or larger naval vessels. You feel the currents in a way that is different, and you are not only bonding with your crewmates, but you're really having a experience with nature that you do not get in other settings when you're on these types of sailing vessels.
I like to say, I talk to people and at groups, what's it like to be out there? I said, well, the sky over your head, the sails just above your head, with your hands on the wheel, your feet on the deck. You can feel the boat underneath you, and the water moving around underneath that. And all kind of exist as one. And it's just one fluid motion, and you get into it. And, people do get seasick, but it goes away quickly, within a day or so. That's no longer a problem. I will say that every great sailor I've been with, America's Cup, transatlantic, Olympic medalist, everybody's had their moment of seasickness. So if anybody fears it, but the beauty thing is our body adapts fairly quickly. In a day or so later, you're okay. Of course, then when you get off the vessel, you're still rocking around for a few hours.
You do have a
That's
distinctive walk.
yeah, you do. You're kind of weaving back and forth, oh, what's this all about? But that goes away too. And then you have a good experience. Well, where are you going to be on July 4th?
Actually, I'm hoping my husband and I are going to be in the city. We're going to be taking a look at all of these lovely tall ships coming in. As I said, I have, want to go see the Harvey Gamage. And again, many of these are vessels that I've either visited or sailed on. And so I'm looking forward to seeing them come in. This is always when the tall ships arrive. I'm always one of the people who are like, are you available? Let's go down.
All right, Tara. I love the enthusiasm and all your knowledge. You must have done a lot of study to understand New York as well as you do. So thank you very much, and
Thank you.
hope to see you around the waterfront over the 4th
Hopefully,
of July
yes,
weekend. Happy
definitely.
250th.
Yes, and happy 4th of July to you. I hope you enjoy this fabulous experience that we're going to have in New York.